it's totally fine. Yeah, so
Next up, Alexander Mathis.
okay, so this slide here is inspired by Ben. This is also not a talk where there will be a big revelation rabbit at the end. In fact, what I wanted to talk to you guys about is what the components of a machine learning system are. So if you know what those are, you should leave now. So yeah, that's really the goal. I think this popped up several times, but I know early on when people raised their hands, there was more than 70% was ecology. So I don't know. Maybe you're actually happy to hear a little bit about computer vision, convolutions, and so on. And that's what I'm going to do. If it's too boring what I talk about, just raise your hand, or I can speed up, slow down. I have 200 slides, so. Right. Okay, but what you really want to learn is that any machine learning system consists of architecture, objective, learning algorithm, and data. And I think what was great actually in the previous talks, in particular Allison's talk, hammered on data and how you need to annotate and how you should annotate and so on. And Ben touched upon several things, and they will come up over and over again. And I think before I go into architectures in particular, I want to highlight this slide, which is from a controversial paper, but a great paper. But what is really nice from this paper is they have this timeline of, let's say, I say machine learning, by the way, but of course this is a bit misleading because I said a machine learning system earlier. And so when they say machine learning here, so if this is kind of time, the time axis, and I want to orient you here a bit on this. So deep learning, it's fun what years Ben put actually, because personally I would say deep learning went from 2012 to 2020, then it ended. Also here, kind of, well no, it keeps going. So that's deep learning, and you've seen a bunch of examples of this. Mega detector is an example of deep learning. We've seen pose estimation today. I'll mostly talk as examples about pose estimation. We've seen deep forest and so on. Then over here, there's foundation models. I will not really talk in this tutorial about foundation models, but you've all heard of them because ChatGPT falls in here. CLIP, you've maybe seen CLIP. This is this language vision model. That would also be a foundation model. What is different about these models in relation, so maybe before I give you that difference, let's go even simpler. And Ben actually had some great examples of this, of classical machine learning. So classical machine learning, the idea is you have some reasonable domain expert derived idea of, let's say you want to analyze some images. And you know in images, edges matter because we know that edge detectors are useful. And you would have a bank of edge detectors. So you should think of a bunch of fixed filters that are kind of used to analyze images. And you would take your image and you process it through this bank of filters. And then you train a classifier that based on those filters solves a task. That is machine learning. Remember, Ben was talking about the early ways in which people did classification of trees. That is a machine learning system, or recommendation systems. This is like the early days of machine learning. Now, why people think there's a transition that happened, I would say in 2012, certainly in computer vision is. So in some sense, not much changed. But what did, so in the sense that you still have features, and those, based on those features, you learn a classifier. But what changed now is that you actually have bigger architectures, and instead of just having kind of features that are domain informed, you have an architecture that represents the data and is learned on your data itself. Okay? So it adapts, and in other words, not just the classifier adapts, but also the encoder, the representation. So a different way that people talk about this here is they talk about representation learning. So in particular, this representation at the kind of end of this neural network here, that changes and adapts, and you would have, for example, a representation for vision, and that representation you then can use on many downstream tasks. And actually my whole talk will be about that paradigm. And this paradigm is sometimes called transfer learning, and that will make sense to you later. But because I'm not going to talk about this component here, there's this other dimension now with foundation models where actually you're not doing transfer learning because it's not about representations. In ChatGPT, you're not taking the weights of OpenAI, you feed it your text, you get some representation of it, and then you learn something on it. You could do that. That would be transfer learning. But typically, the exciting thing that has happened there, and that's what these guys call as emergence of functionalities, is that these models can actually do something that is in context learning. But this, I cannot talk about this in the interest of time. We can discuss this later with pizza and beer. Okay, so what I do want to talk about is this classical idea of transfer learning in here. Okay, and I'm going to talk about this task of what is called pose estimation. It's a very classical task. It also came up today for like landmark registration, finding particular points in an image of, here it's usually body parts on animals. And I want to motivate this from an important review from Anderson Perona and Perona. And here you have, for example, two flies, they're in a dish, they're walking around. And what you're actually interested in is detecting when what fly does what behavior, and create like a graph that has like transitions between the different behaviors. This is what is called an ethogram. And this is, I mean, it still is a reasonable pipeline to do this task. At first, you basically track or localize your fly, you extract the pose, from that you get some temporal trajectories, and that gives you features. And again, just in a classical machine learning way, you have features that represent each fly in this dish. You train a classifier that does action detection, and with these detected actions, you can then make this ethogram. Okay? So here you can see that in classical pipelines of cataloging behaviors, pose estimation is really important, but we also saw today already earlier examples of where pose estimation can be super important. For example, if you want to study color in plumages of birds. Okay? And I'm talking about, so now let me talk about pose estimation. And essentially, pose estimation is a class, like is a very simple supervised machine learning task, where your goal is you have, for example, a bunch of pictures of a mouse that is reaching out for a joystick and pulling it. You will see it in a second. And here, specifically, we would be interested in understanding how the mouse reaches out and holds the joystick. But it really is not about this mouse or these key points. This task is for any kind of problem. And it's this problem of localizing specific key points in an image, okay? So now imagine we have a bunch of labeled images, like those, where we have x and y coordinates of different key points. We have the image. Then what we created 5 years ago now is a toolbox called Deep LabCut. And it consists, it's actually a very simple architecture where you have a deep neural net. So this is what is usually called the encoder. And this encoder part is actually pre-trained on ImageNet. So it's not trained on pose estimation initially, but it has been trained to really say this is a cat, this is a dog, and so on. So you have weights here that already understand something about vision. And then in Deep LabCut specifically, let's say if you want to localize these several key points, then you set it up like an image-to-image translation problem, where you take this neural net, and for each key point, you output one output map, okay, where the image at the output encodes the probability of where a particular key point is in this image. And in that sense, you can think of it as an image-to-image translation problem, because input is an RGB, here it's just a grayscale image, of course, and output is a probability density. And I will literally show you pictures later on. So in this paper, what we showed is that first this works really well based on state-of-the-art architectures at that time. And I think what was exciting in this paper was that we showed this works with almost like very little work. So if you label 141 frames like this, and you train your own little neural network, then it works, it generalizes to other mice, and so on. And what is exciting here is, of course, that I mean, there's nothing, apart from your data, there's nothing specific you need to do, no? You could do a completely different problem. For example, let's say you're interested in, you have these well plates, and you have cancer cells, and you have T cells that kill cancer cells, and you want to track how the T cells kill the cancer cells. You can do the same thing. You click on a bunch of images, you train Deep LabCut, and you will track those things. Or let's say you have some tissue that you want to track, like a tendon down here, or some throat imaging. You can do that, and you can track two marmosets in a cage, or you can track this funny animal down here. Okay, so the point here is that this is really, here the neural network or deep learning is just a general approximator that goes from images to localize key points in those images. Of course, and in my talk that will become clear, this is also interesting because images are super high dimensional, hard to analyze, low dimensional x and y coordinates over time, that's low dimensional, interpretable, you can do all kinds of things with that. And this tool has really developed a lot. We have now more than 500,000 downloads in 5 years. And a lot of people use it. A lot of people also contribute to it. But what I want to do in this tutorial is talk more a bit about the science behind this. And I think with the idea of what is in a machine learning system, I want to kind of give you a very general kind of perspective on like a paradigm shift that is now 10 years old. And the idea here is this idea of software 2.0. And this is this idea that in these kinds of systems, like with classical, if you write some code to analyze your data, you write code that analyzes your data. There's no integration of annotation data, of neural network weights, and so on in your problem specifically. But in Deep Lab Cut, in many, many other projects that we actually saw, like today, you do have this integration. So here, it's really essential that you create a project somewhere in your machine where you extract specific frames that actually, as we saw in other talks, they need to be different instances. You don't want to label the same frame 1,000 times. And then you have these instances. You pick a neural net. You train the neural net on that task. Then you evaluate the performance. If you're happy with the performance on your new videos, you move on. And if you're not, you refine and you label some more. And then if it works, then you can just share these weights with your collaborators, or you can run it somewhere else, you can deploy it in the cloud, whatever. You can analyze all kinds of data. But what is essential here in the software 2.0 concept is that in this workflow, you need graphical user interfaces because you also annotate data yourself, and it's your data, and you actually make a specialized model on your data here. And what I think I maybe didn't make too clear so far is that with transfer learning in this architecture itself, it's quite important that our encoder here has been trained on a large-scale data set before. And if it wasn't, if you're not transferring it from a large-scale data set to your small-scale data set, then you would not be able to get a good architecture or good performance with very few labeled frames. Okay? So now that's somewhat the motivation. I hope software 2.0 makes sense. And I now want to go back to these technical details. And you can see that all these technical details here now make sense in the software 2.0 framework. The architecture is, let's say, the model that translates your input data to your output data for which you solve a so-called supervised task. So it solves an objective. In my case, it's an image-to-image translation problem. Then the learning algorithm, that's the algorithm with which you change the weights of your neural network to solve the task. And then data is the data that you annotate, okay? So let's go through all those 4 components in the next 15 minutes. And let's start with a really simple neural network. And I'm a neuroscientist, so I have to start with Donald Hebb. So I'm not going to talk about heavy learning, but let's start with the simplest neural net that we can imagine. It's literally one neuron. It has n inputs, okay? And then for each one of those inputs, there's one weight. So you can think of that as the synaptic connectivity. And we just, so this neuron will weigh, so the membrane potential, if you want, of this neuron is the current coming from other neurons times the weight, and you sum it up over all the different inputs, okay? And so now this is a linear neuron, so it literally does nothing else than sum this up, and that's what it passes on. Okay, so that's the diagram. Now let's look at a formula, but I think we can all deal with this. This is very simple. This is just y is equal to w times x. No, this is actually a scalar product of the weight vector and the input vector. So this is really the same picture. That's algebra. That's a diagram. But now let's go to geometry, because everything is always nicer in geometry. And in particular, has anyone an idea what geometric figure this corresponds to? This algebra? And by the way, is this too slow, too boring? I don't know. I'm sure the computer vision guys are super bored, but that's not my target audience, to be honest. So, yeah, so this, what is this? I mean, it's a...
Parabola?
Yeah, it's a linear equation, so it's a linear neuron. So the word, the geometric object we're looking for is a subset of this word.
It's a line.
It's a line. Yeah, so parabola, should be somewhere square. But indeed, this is a linear neuron, so if you would, for example, have a nonlinear transfer function, you would get something like this. So now this is just a line. And now I took this super simple example. So imagine now you solve this really hard machine learning problem where you have two features. Feature 1 down here, that's 1x1, okay? And then feature 2 here, and that would be x2. And we have data points because we annotated some data points, okay? So we have, for each data point that we have, they can only have 2 dimensions. And then some of these data points, someone annotated and said, well, that's a dog, and that's a cat, and so on, okay? So now, what a single linear neuron can essentially do is, the weights describe a line, okay? And you can put all kinds of lines through this diagram here. But what you actually want to do is, you want to find a line that separates these two classes, okay? And that's the basic idea of a classifier, okay? So here it's not even, I mean, we have fixed features, and a linear neuron can essentially define a line that gives you a decision boundary so that everything that would be to the left of, let's say, this, will be classified as a red object, so here a cat, and everything that is to the right of this would be classified as a blue object. And now that's why, so that's just the mechanics of the architecture, okay? So this is what a single linear neuron can do. It can just draw a line through things, and then of course you can stack them on top of each other, like if you have a classifier that goes like this, and you have another neuron that classifies this, you can imagine that you can kind of cut up and make very complicated decision boundaries in a nutshell. And what I should also say, and that's maybe why HEP came up, of course in machine learning it's about learning. And the idea is typically that these would be samples, and that you arrive at this specific solution of how this boundary goes through learning, through iterating through these specific samples and coming up with a decision boundary. Okay. So now I will speed up quite a bit on the next slide. So if you have some questions about that, now is a good time, because the next slide is ImageNet and big models. Okay. I go from 1 neuron to millions.
So that single neuron, you say that it's just for kind of placing a line in different places. Can it also like then rotate that line and place it in all different kind of, or would that involve a separate?
Yeah, so if the neuron is fixed, if you don't change the weights, then its parameters define exactly how the line is. So if now you would have, and this was mentioned a bunch of times, like domain shift, let's say the dogs kind of move up here, then your line needs to move in order to correctly classify cats and dogs. Yeah. And that would be some domain adaptation mechanism or something like this. So as long as if you don't learn, if you don't change the weights, the geometry of how you decide is fixed. Yeah. And a line may seem really trivial, and it is somewhat, but keep in mind neural networks have stacked neurons on top of each other. So even with lines, you can build very, very complicated decision boundaries, and yeah, okay. Yeah. So far we've seen a linear neural network, well, 1 neuron, but as I said, I think deep learning got really going, and well, actually, this is a good picture because so here you actually see the kind of seismic change of deep learning up to a few years ago. And SIFT plus, what is this here? SVM probably. This is the performance of SIFT, specific domain expert features for vision. And then you train a decoder on them. So here these representation, it's not important what it is, it's actually not changing. So the only thing that is changing when you train it on on ImageNet is the decoder. And this paper here was published like in 2013. It's called AlexNet, and basically this plot summarizes some of the kind of the seismic changes, namely that with this model, so these guys took a neural network that has many, many layers, and it's actually a convolutional neural network, and I'll tell you in a second what that is. And they got a huge boost in performance, like huge. Before that, like whatever, it went up from 46 to 47, just like Ben was saying, like don't even bother taking the state of the art. You jitter around a little bit. But from here to here, that's really a huge change, and there was a massive change. And the other thing, and that's sometimes forgotten, I think, like the biggest change from here to here was the mindset. And it was the idea that here you had feature representations and you train a decoder. And over here, you're in transfer learning world. So you actually learn representations and you reuse representations and you adapt representations. And with that, you can do completely different things. Okay? So, so AlexNet was very good on ImageNet. You've all heard about this. But these neural networks in AlexNet in particular, they're not random neural networks like this single line thing that I was describing. And let me show you again a nice graph to illustrate this. So what you see here is, so down here, that would be, let's say, the input image that we are giving to our neural network. And what you see up here, that would be the output of our neural network, okay? But, and what this diagram is supposed to tell you is that this neural network is actually always taking 3 by 3 pixel inputs and multiplies the input, so the 3 by 3 pixel values at this location by a certain filter that is 3 by 3. Okay, so here you have just 3 by 3, so 9 weights, and they are used to create this pattern up here. That's the, yeah. Now, the trick is that you actually use the same weights everywhere in your image, okay? Forget about what those weights are, they're just 9 numbers. So because you use the same weights everywhere, notice that just logically speaking, what you actually have is a situation where an image is translated into something that also looks like an image. So in other words, you can stack these things on top of each other. And that's really what a convolutional neural network does. And you can hope that your neural network does interesting things. Okay, so it's really not what is otherwise called a fully connected neural network, but in fact, your so-called kernel here has topographic understanding of the scene. So for example, this pixel here is related to things that are over here, and this pixel is related to things that are over here. Okay, so you have a mapping that is spatially correct in a convolutional neural network. And that, of course, makes a lot of sense if you process images where, for example, whatever, the sky is usually on top. That's something you can exploit, and that's something a neural network can exploit. And yeah, and I should say also as a neuroscientist, this is, of course, inspired by how the visual system is wired up in mammals. Okay, so that is a single convolution, but you can do funnier things. Imagine that you have an input image that is really high resolution. Maybe you work like Ben with these nasty data. And if you would have to work with these super big images, you would need a gigantic GPU to process this and hold this in your memory. So but keep in mind, of course, neighboring pixels usually have kind of the same values, no more or less. I mean, whatever, there's correlation in the world. So you can exploit that. And so here's one thing, this is again a convolution, but you're exploiting the fact that, well, maybe I shouldn't actually always look at all neighboring pixels, but I could just, with my kernel, I just skip one ahead. And that's one way to process an image and actually downsample it, okay? And guess what? A strided convolution exists, so the opposite also exists. That's a strided deconvolution. So imagine you have a 3 by 3 feature map like here. What you can now do is you can upsample that information, and one way to kind of in your head think about that is you would blow holes into it, like here, and then you just slide your 3 by 3 filter across. And that way you can upsample. And now if we go back to Deep LabCut's architecture, and Sarah is very proud of this because this intermediate architecture here is by her new hire colleague from MIT. So Kai-Min He is really a genius. This is one of my absolute favorite papers, I think, in the last 10 years. So it's called a ResNet. And just to give you some impact of this paper, it was published in 2016, and I think it has 180,000 citations. Okay, so that's a lot. Made quite some impact, so maybe you want to know about it. So what's exciting about this architecture? So in a nutshell, nothing. No, seriously. So this one specifically is a ResNet 50. So it has 50 layers. So we have already heard about convolutions, and this thing is just really, really deep. You stack many, many, many convolutions on top of each other. Here I have a specific diagram for you. That's in fact how it looks. So you have first it starts off by a 7x7 convolution. In fact, you have 64 filters and the pooling, let's forget about that. And then you have a 3x3 convolution, you have 64, you have 3x3, so you literally have these like 9 3x3 things that you slide across, but you have many, 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 many. And so mathematically, what that means is your model is extremely kind of expressive of how it could represent that data. But so the name here in ResNet suggests that there's something else happening, that it's not just a ConvNet that you would have published 2 years earlier, but this ResNet actually has some trick, and in fact it has these skipped connections, which by the way the brain also has between brain areas. And I want to give you some, in a second I will give you an idea why these skipped connections are really important. But before we discuss this, this neural network that is very, very deep is also trained on a large scale data set, okay? So at that time it was trained on ImageNet, so you have roughly 1 million images where you have 1,000 different classes, so it's a very fine-grained classification task. Here are different examples of the class hammer. So notice that these are actually very different instances of a hammer. No, it's not like a hammer on a table and a hammer on the floor. It's like hammers in all kinds of different positions, and that was really essential. And what I think is the most important thing about that kind of research is that people realize that if you pre-train such a convolutional neural network, you can do all kinds of downstream tasks in very efficient ways, and that's this transfer learning paradigm. And am I 27 minutes in? So
Yeah, maybe 3 more minutes. Maybe 5.
so I'm on slide 68. No. So what I do want to drive home is the following point. If logically speaking, so we were talking about training sets and test sets, and it's really important to keep those two separate, because you can perhaps imagine that if you make this neural network deeper and deeper and deeper, you are kind of more expressive. No, you can approximate more complicated things, but you can really only do so on your training set, because, well, that's the set you have seen. And indeed, why this paper by Kai-Min He is so exciting is, until this paper, no one knew how to train deep models, actually, like very deep. And the problem was that if you train, let's say, a model that had 10 layers, or a model that had 20 layers, of course a model with 20 layers is more powerful, it should be better. And indeed, it converged to a lower loss on your training set, so it could express the training set better. It actually ended up being worse on the test set. So in other words, it overfits on the data. And what they argued is that this is not a problem of the architecture. It's clearly also not a problem of the data, but it was a problem of the learning algorithm, the optimization of how you actually optimize your parameters. And so they solved the optimization issue by an architecture trick where they introduced these skipped connections, and which essentially helps in backpropagating the gradient through which you learn and update your weights. Okay? And in that paper, they showed that they can train deeper models and actually also generalize better with deeper models. So then, let me just show you this final thing. So indeed, in Deep LabCut, you really set it up like an image-to-image translation problem where, for example, on this little marmoset here, you want to predict the little probability density exactly on its back, and then that's what the model is trained on. And yeah, that's all slides I wanted to show you.